So it's laying the foundations, and my presentation today will focus very much on the commissioning of the new Children's Hospital in Aberdeen, and we are going back quite a few years now. However, I do believe the principles and some of the things that happened then are still very applicable today. I'm going to give some history about the hospital and the lead up to the build, and I'm going to also highlight the importance of involving staff, different teams of people, and of course the children, young people and their parents in the lead up to a build like this. Next slide, please, Simon. So just a little bit of history about the Children's Hospital in Aberdeen. For my knowledge, there have been three. So the first one was built in 1877. The next one was built in 1929, and allegedly at the time that building was there for the next 30 years. However, the next hospital actually opened in 2004. So it just goes to show how things change. And when I first went to Aberdeen, that's where I was. I was actually in the 1929 building, which was a single story building. As you can imagine, quite old, quite a lot of things needed replacing. However, one thing that was very, very important to say is that the culture and the teamwork in that place was excellent. So I think sometimes we think very much about the building, but I cannot stress enough the importance of having a good team within a building, and that doesn't matter at times if it is an old or brand new building. Thank you, Simon. And I've got some photographs, next slide please, Simon, of how it looks now, and Pauline, you may be able to say at the end if it still looks like this, but there seems to be quite a lot of zoological animals there outside of the hospital now that weren't there when I was there. And if we go on to how it looked when I was there, one thing that I really remember on the next slide is, the brightness of the fact that it was a children's hospital. And I think, to be involved in the commissioning of a new children's hospital was fabulous. And I felt very honoured to be part of that, because of course, things when it comes to finances now are really quite different. Thank you, Simon. The next slide. So things don't happen overnight. And the planning of this building really did start in about 1995 to 1996. And at the time, there was a study tour of a variety of hospital sites in the UK and also America. And from that, in 1996, 1997, they started then putting together the business case for the new build. And then, of course, that business case went in time to the Scottish Executive, and there was a visit in the year 2000, January 2000, by the then Secretary of State for Health, Donald Dewar, who visited Aberdeen, visited the site, visited the potential site for the new build, and the full business case was approved after his build, after his visit. And then, of course, from the health board's point of view, because of course, for those people who haven't worked in Scotland, the organisation of the NHS there is quite different. They have health boards and don't have health trusts. They then appointed the design team, and that was Mackie Ramsey Taylor. Okay, next slide, please, Simon. And of course, it was amazing what was done with the funding. The building itself, there was a cost of £24.7 million, and £23 million of that was released from the capital in NHS Grampian, because that's where the Royal Aberdeen Children's Hospital sits. And in that there was also £2.5 million, which came from the Archie Foundation. And the Archie Foundation was the charity that was set up specifically for the Children's Hospital. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. There was also just over 1.5 million from an A&E modernisation monies, and also the University of Aberdeen, they also provided some funding for the Institute of Child Health, which again sat both within the university and the Children's Hospital. There was £700,000 for the arts project, and that was gained to really enhance the environment. £1 million for a new PACS system. And then, of course, there was additional Archie funding that was provided for other things. For example, there, you know what I mean, we didn't have to take one bed from the old hospital to the new. Everything was like that, was actually brand new for the day that we moved in. Thank you, Simon. So, of course, as I've said, it was really important from the offset to involve staff, because of course many of the staff had worked in the old building for many years, and they were really, you know, I suppose wedded in some respects to that building, but were also very excited about moving to the new build. So they were involved in the development and the translation of the brief, and then there were also specific areas that really considered what new clinical equipment they were required. What was the specification for this new build that they would like? Because they had a real opportunity here, because the funding was there. And then there were also specific working groups that were set up so that everybody was very much kept up to date with all of the progress as the building was taking place. And then, of course, there required to be development of new policies, new procedures, and because it was going to be quite different, it wasn't replicating the old building, there was going to have to be quite a lot of reorganisation of the teams. And of course, closer to the time of the move, closer to that relocation, there was quite a lot that was required for the preparation for that move. Thank you, Simon. And then, of course, you know, as the time got closer, moving from the old building to the new building, there was a huge focus on orientation and training. And of course, it was really getting up to speed with what those hospital policies looked like, what the hospital looked like, because it was a very different building. It was had a very different feeling to the new building. And of course, you know, there were new teams that were developed, new departments that were developed, and there was very much, you know, that real importance of, you know, teams getting together and starting to build that new team before they actually moved in to the building. A lot of new equipment, you know, variable height baths, which were fabulous, a new nurse call system, and then there was a lot of positive and negative ventilation for the different areas in reference to things like infection control and theatres, etc. And again, one of the biggest things was really getting used to, you know, working in a new care environment. You know, in the old building, that was a single story building, but of course the new build was a vertical building with single rooms, and that was one of the things that actually caused quite a lot of, shall we say, stress at times, thinking about, you know, how we could manage working in a single room, what was the staffing that was going to be required in order to do that. And then of course, you know, there was new systems just in reference to security and of course the parent accommodation as well. Thank you, Simon. And one of the big things was making sure that, you know, the ideas didn't come just purely from either design teams or from the staff working in the hospitals. So the young advisors were a very important group of people who really did get involved in that piece of work. Thank you, Simon. We'll have the next slide, please. And in 1997, there was the establishment of the Young Advisors Club. And this was a joint health and education initiative that started off with a 2-day conference. And the aim of that was really to involve the children and young people of Grampian in the planning of the new hospital so that they could influence the environment. And it was very, very interesting when some of those meetings took place with the young people and children, what they wanted. It was very evident that they no longer wanted the classic Disney type of characters in the different areas, but they wanted bright colours. And that was very, important to them. And they also were very aware of the fact that, there would be better accommodation for their parents. And, they, were really considerate about what they wanted for their parents. And there was one young man who, thought it might be a good idea if there was a bar in the hospital for the parents. But of course, that didn't happen. But it was great to hear, some of those considerations that the young people did actually want for their parents. And of course, being part of this project, that it needed to be educationally rewarding for the children involved. Okay, and so for some of them that went quite, towards some of their project work, for some of the exams that they were working towards. And of course, by including young people, that helped raise the profile of the new hospital project, because there were young people there, the young advisors from a variety of schools, who then started talking with their peers about the work that they were involved in, and that again really did raise the profile of the hospital project in the hospitals and the public's perception. So that was great, actually, to get them involved. But of course, next slide, please, Simon. Parents were also very important as well, because again, as with a lot of old builds, the facilities for parents had been somewhat makeshift, but everybody had done extremely well. But of course, quite often, if they were staying with their child in hospital, they were quite often in very cramped conditions. And there was that real acknowledgement to say that parents were partners in the care of their child, and they were important when it came to really looking at this project and to look at the new build and really thinking about what they wanted as well. For information, from a facilities point of view, there was going to be 39 ward-based single rooms with space for a parent, and they had the pull-down beds from the room, and each of those rooms also had a mini fridge within those rooms, not for the parents' drinks necessarily, but for other things for parents. And then there was also a parental suite, and there was 20 parent bedrooms there with 16 single beds and 4 twin or double beds, so that couples could stay together. And again, that was very, very important and well thought through, especially during that time. And then of course there were ward-based sitting rooms and toilets, and then shower facilities for the non-resident parents as well. Thank you, Simon. And of course there was a whole host of people involved in the commissioning teams, from project directors, development managers, other managers. Important that there was clinical presence on the commissioning team. So there was a commissioning team of with a doctor, with a nurse, who also represented the allied health professionals as well. a commissioning officer, and then of course members of the hospital management team who dipped in and out of those meetings but met regularly with the commissioning team, so that everybody felt as if they were up to speed with what was happening when and what was required for the next stage of the process before the actual day of the move. Thank you, Simon. And of course, the design team consisted of all of those people that you would consider, but again, sort of like from a hospital point of view, it was important to be very aware of who those people were and to meet regularly with them. Thank you, Simon. And then of the construction team, again, you know, that consisted of the main contractor and subspecialists. And I think the important thing as well is, you know, I was often invited up to the building at various stages in the build, just for clarification at times, just so that, you know, from my point of view as the senior nurse for the hospital, I was, shall we say, happy, or, you know, felt up to date with what was happening during that time. Next slide, please, Simon. And then, of course, you know, it wasn't just about the team within the hospital. It was also important that, you know, other trust staff were considered as well. So, of course, you know, that was the trust executive team, the risk management team, infection control team, central stores, and then, of course, fire and security as well. And again, for me, this was a great learning curve, you know, to really consider all of those different aspects of being involved in the commissioning, but the importance of all of those roles, and not just focusing on, you know, the clinical roles as well. So that was really, really important. Thank you, Simon. Now, I've mentioned a little bit about the environment, but one of the other parallel projects was the arts group, because of course the aim of the arts group was to ensure that there was the creation of a child and family environment. You know, there's a real opportunity here, and of course that environment needed to reflect the diversity of the age groups that were going to be cared for within the hospital. And also there was a big focus on play and recognising the role of play as not only a source of entertainment, but also as an essential information and learning medium. And of course, you know, those children's nurses on the call today will be very aware of the importance of play when it came to distraction. And all of that was taken into account. You know, what sort of artwork would be en route to the theatres, for example, you know, again, by way of distraction, or what sort of artwork would be in some of the areas where there were children and young people who needed more of a, you know, sensory environment to help them with their care. And of course, the artwork needed to create a non-threatening but also a visually stimulating environment, and I believe it did. And also, you know, that real feeling of being friendly, interesting and welcoming. And on the photograph on the slide that you can see at the moment, these were the chairs that were in the main entrance at the time for people to sit on. Fabulous wood, you know, will last a lifetime, but really said something. And of course, you know, that fabulous window where people could just wait in that area and look out onto greenery, which was really, really important. Next slide, please, Simon. And what I've just done here, I've just used some of the photographs from a long time ago, actually, of some of the artwork. So this is a slinky, which was in one of the courtyards. And, you know, at night time, this goes to different colours, okay, which is fabulous. Next slide, please, Simon. And this is in the hospital chapel. Okay, it's a window, and when the sun shines, it shines right through that window. And the artist who created this, she depicted the sky, the mountains of Scotland, the sea, and the oil, and the brown is the oil. Okay, and so that was absolutely fabulous. And on another wall in the chapel was an embroidery that also depicted that. But the hospital chaplain at the time, James, I mean, this was his pride and joy, and he thoroughly enjoyed this when he moved in to that hospital chapel. Next slide, please, Simon. And of course, you know, I've spoken about a little bit about the Archie Foundation, and they were very important. The Archie Foundation was originally set up purely for the Royal Aberdeen Children's Hospital. It was a registered charity with its own identity, and the aim at the time was to raise £3 million. And when the appeal closed, and this just shows, you know, how generous the people of the Northeast, you know, are and were, the appeal closed with a fund of £5 million. And that was absolutely fantastic. And another, you know, important area was the press, the local press and the media. There's a journal, well, a paper there called the Press and Journal, and at the time I became quite good friends with somebody called Mitchell, and I don't know whether he still does his Mitchell's Diary, but he was always wanting, you know, stories for what was happening, just so that everybody locally was very aware of the progress of the new build. And of course they were very, you know, aware of a lot of the fundraising that was taking place, and really wanted to be kept up to speed with all of that, which was great. And if there were any ceremonies that I'll talk about later, the Press and Journal in particular were always invited to those, and there's quite a lot of media interest from the local televisions as well. And the public, you know, they were kept up to date with the progress, and every donation that was given to the Archie Fund was acknowledged. And again, there was a wall with some very small tiles on it, and each of these small tiles represented, you know, different people who'd given monies towards the Archie Foundation, and it didn't matter whether or not it was £50 or £5,000. Everything was acknowledged. And also when it came to the parents' bedrooms, you know, quite a lot of people wanted to almost like buy, you know, one of the bedrooms, and that's where their donation went, and that was all acknowledged on the doors or next to the doors of the bedrooms. Thank you, Simon. Next slide, please. So, you know, again, things don't just happen overnight. You know, you have this new build, and then it isn't just about moving in the following day. There's quite a lot of things that need to be checked in order to prepare to occupy that new build, and in our case, to occupy the new building. So there's, you know, that whole thing about the receipt of keys, large amounts of keys, let me tell you, you know, and linked in with that, you know, was that whole importance around security, and then, you know, that management of fire and fire risk, and that all needed to be had to be go through very carefully, you know, with some of the staff involved. Quite a lot of snagging and checking, and this was particularly where, you know, when it came to the commissioning team, the clinical staff really came involved, because of course, you know, they knew if you're working in a high dependency, you know how many socket points you require. And, you know, if that wasn't up to the speed before we moved in, things could be changed very quickly. And, you know, and you wanted to know exactly where the positioning of all of those things were to make the ease of caring for those children better. Lots to do with cleaning, obviously, prior to that, because of course what you're moving into, you know, by rights is a building site. So there's a huge amount of cleaning that needs to take place, and of course lots and lots of infection control checks as well. I've mentioned earlier about the negative and the positive ventilation, and of course all of that needed to be considered when it came to those infection control checks as well. Equipping it and furnishing it, and a lot of this took place prior to the day of the move. And then of course lots of orientation and training for the staff on the build up to it, when they could actually move in to the building, you know, have a really good look around, see how it was with some of the equipment in there. And then of course linked in with that was that familiarization with the new policies. And then of course within all of that was a big, you know, big piece of work, and that was the IT transfer plan, you know, moving all of that information technology and ensuring that it did work. And then of course, you know, something quite small in some respects but very big, you know, we needed a new telephone directory, because of course all of those extension numbers were going to be very different to what they had been prior to the move. Next slide please, Simon. Okay, and then of course the relocation. Sunday morning, January the 25th, I can remember it still, and you know, a fabulous day. You know, we were blessed with great weather, and you know, and I can tell you now that every patient was moved by 12:30 at midday, which was great. But there were certain things to consider in all of that, and of course the first one was the double running. So of course, you know, there were two teams of people. There was those teams who were delivering care in the old hospital, and those staff that were accepting the patients, who were commissioning, you know, the new build when those first patients you know, arrived. And of course that was very much about implementation of the relocation plan. And you know, it actually worked like military precision. From my point of view, I remained in the old build, and you know, was very much involved in making sure that everything and everybody was leaving in a timely manner. And of course that includes a lot of logistics, not only with the teams within the hospital, but as you can imagine, the ambulance and service and others as well. And one brilliant team, and throughout it all, you know, for weeks before the relocation day, was Pickford's the removal. They were fabulous, and you know, stayed on site for weeks, you know, whilst they were moving quite a lot of what they could move without compromising the care for the patients in the old building. And I think, you know, on that patient move day, there really was multi-agency working. I remember, you know, it's sort of like the night before, everybody and anybody, you know, putting up shower curtains, just doing those last minute.com things, you know, to make sure that the move was going to be as smooth as it possibly could do. And of course, you know, there was a lot of that was required, you know, to inform the public, and GP information. Letters went out to everybody. There was a lot of information on the local media, the TV, the radio, and the local press, and quite a lot of interest on the day from all of that media, you know, without getting in the way of the move that was taking place. Next slide, Simon. And one of the things that was really important was to make sure that everybody started on a full stomach, and especially the Pickford guides and the ambulance crews and all of those people. And what I did was I ensured that there were adequate, and probably too many, bacon sandwiches at the ready at the start of the day, about 7 o'clock in the morning, where everybody gathered ready for that big day move. And let me tell you, they went down a tree. And just to say that Simon said he thinks these are pulled pork rather than bacon sandwiches, but hey ho. Okay, and the next slide shows, the hospital in its entirety as it was when I was there. And as I say there, it was well worth the wait. It really was. And the next slide, please, Simon. So we moved in the January, but prior to that, next slide, please, Simon, if you can. Thank you. Thank you. There were some ceremonies to celebrate, and that's really, really important. So there was the turf cutting ceremony that took place in January 2001, and that was done by 2 young advisors aged 9 and 14. Very, very important to continue with their participation in this very important project. And then the foundation stone of the build was laid in June 2002, and that was laid by Bob Abercrombie, who was the longest member of staff with 38 years service, who worked, he was the head chef basically in the kitchen, and that great person who provided all of those bacon sandwiches for us. And then, as I said before, the move day took place on the 25th of January 2004, which again, for those people who may not know, that's Burns Night. That's when Burns Night is celebrated. So seemed quite apt, actually. And then the official opening by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II took place in October 2005. And as you can see, it was a right royal do. It was great. It was absolutely great. She was very well versed and prepared for the move, and I believe everybody really did enjoy it and felt very proud of the building that was shown to her on the day. Next slide, please, Simon. And there we go again with some of my colleagues, clinical director Michael Bissett, and also the chair of the trust. Thank you. Do you want to stop sharing the presentation, please, Simon?
Thank you, Angela. Apologies. I was trying to get off mute.
No problem. And I'll say to and I'm just going to put Pauline on the spot and say, is that how you remembered it?
Absolutely, Angela. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation there, and it was quite reminiscent. So thank you for that. Yeah, that's how I remember it. And just for the callers that are online, is I guess the success and feeling quite proud and thinking back on how well it went. And one of the reasons it was so successful was because of the leadership at the time. So thank you for that. But it was a kind of team approach, and that's the bit that that made everything work. And the actual move day was kind of like an anticlimax because it just happened. But it was all the preparation before that was the key, and how we formed teams and really came together. I was in high dependency at the time, so for us it was a massive change in the working environment. So we moved from a Nightingale ward, which was quite dark, had some leaks. We had nowhere to prepare IVs, and it was tiny, and it was really difficult and to navigate around that environment to, a massive HDU area with a big open bay, individual rooms with proper ventilation, proper equipment, and a massive preparation room for our IVs at the side, which allowed us to make, really safe care, because we had that space to prepare medication, quite complex medication, and administer that more in a safer way. So an environment is still there. I often go up because that's part of my role. Some of it's dated, and the arts and Archie is still there, and they still invest a lot in the environment, and that's something that gives you a nice feel when you go into the building. The lightness and the brightness of the building's still there, but it keeps on growing these giraffes and elephants at the front, but they've done some work in the outside environment as well, because that's really important to families. So
Thank you.
It's good.
And I can also see Isla on the call as well. So again,
I wasn't hiding at all, Angela.
This is going back 20 odd years.
It's 20 years this year since I moved up to Aberdeen. Yeah, and I came just before the official opening, so before the Queen came to officially open, but obviously after all the events that you were speaking about. And I've worked in a variety of hospitals over the years with a variety of mix of environments, and I have to say, hands down, out of all of them, the one up at the Children's Hospital here in Aberdeen is the most open and patient friendly and child friendly area. And Pauline's right, they've continued to invest. The work outside with the giant topiary giraffes and elephants has made that entrance into the environment so much better than it probably, not that it wasn't a nice entrance, but it's been made even better over the years, probably since you left, Angela. But inside is still as bright and airy as it can ever be. The views across Aberdeen are stunning. The parents get a lot of comfort out of that view. You can watch all weathers in one day, as we know in Aberdeen. So yeah, it's still one of the best places I've worked. And I think your influence, I wasn't there during that development beforehand, but I'm sure Pauline agrees, out of all the line managers I've had, you're still one of the best I've had, Angela. And I think your strength came through during that period of change for the team, I have no doubt.
Thank you. Lovely to see you both.
You too.
Thank you, everybody. Is there any other questions or comments for Angela?
I have. Angela, were there enough plugs?
Yes.
And that is the real important thing, because I am aware of somewhere else that didn't have sufficient plugs, or indeed plug sockets in the right position in the wall, particularly within high dependency intensive care units. So well done for making sure that there was sufficient plugs in the right place.
I think, Fiona, to be fair, there is something really important about the commissioning team, and that communication between the commissioning team, the hospital team, and then all of those people who are going to be the users. Actually, without that input, there's always this thing, isn't there, that people think they know best, but it's about the users actually, and the importance there, and what's required, and never being afraid in those early stages to say, actually, that's not going to work. I'll tell you a story about the Children's Hospital, and Pauline, probably you can remember this. In the old Children's Hospital, there was a room for parents who went there to have a smoke, have a cigarette. Well, I couldn't believe it, but there you go. Who am I, sort of thing. And one day, the key to this room got lost. And it was never found again. And interestingly, on some of the plans, the first plans for the new build, there was a room for parents' smoking room that never went through. You know what I mean? So, and again, there was quite a lot of discussion about, is that the right time for people to stop smoking, and all of those type of things. However, one of the things then that was very evident, the whole thing around no smoking in Scotland was probably much more evident earlier than, in the rest of the UK. So it was a great opportunity to make those changes early doors, about that, and that lost key was never found.
Well done.
Thank you, everybody.